When Japanese pilots first encountered the P-38 Lightning over the Pacific, many laughed at its ungainly twin-boom design. The bizarre configuration with engines mounted on separate booms flanking a central nacelle looked like an engineering mistake that somehow flew. Japanese intelligence dismissed it as another heavy American fighter that nimble Zeros would easily outmaneuver. Then the P-38s started killing Japan's best pilots, appearing from impossible distances, surviving damage that should have been fatal, and executing tactics Japanese doctrine had no answer for. What followed was a dark journey from mockery to fear, to grudging recognition that this strange aircraft represented advantages Japan couldn't counter. In late 1942, when reconnaissance photographs of P-38 Lightnings first reached Japanese intelligence headquarters, analysts assumed the images showed experimental prototypes that would never enter mass production. The twin-boom configuration seemed absurdly complex for a fighter aircraft. 2 engines, 2 booms, triple the mechanical systems to maintain compared to single-engine designs that Japanese aviation philosophy considered optimal for maneuverability and simplicity, making the American design appear to be a desperate improvisation by engineers who couldn't build proper fighters rather than a deliberate design optimized for Pacific combat conditions. Japanese pilots who first engaged P-38s over the Solomons reported back with confident assessments. The aircraft was heavy, weighing over 17,000 pounds fully loaded compared to the Zero's 6,000 pounds. It couldn't turn with Japanese fighters in traditional dogfights. Initial combat reports described P-38s as clumsy opponents that Japanese aces could easily defeat through superior maneuverability, with several claiming victories through standard turning engagements where the Lightning's bulk and weight made it sluggish compared to the Zero's legendary agility that had dominated early Pacific air combat. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's staff prepared threat assessments ranking American aircraft by capability. The P-38 received moderate priority, dangerous when used correctly, but fundamentally flawed by its complexity. Intelligence officers calculated that the Lightning's maintenance requirements would limit operational readiness, its twin engines would consume fuel at rates that restricted combat radius, and its weight would prevent the climbing performance necessary for effective interception, creating a comfortable assessment that minimized the threat while validating Japanese design philosophy, emphasizing lightweight, maneuverable fighters. One Zero pilot famously described the P-38 as 2 aircraft welded together by confused Americans who couldn't decide which engine to use. The joke circulated through Japanese fighter squadrons, reinforcing dismissive attitudes. But the laughter died when combat revealed what the twin engines actually meant. On April 18, 1943, Japanese naval intelligence intercepted and decoded a message revealing Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's inspection tour schedule to forward bases in the Solomon Islands. American codebreakers had already read the same message and were planning something unprecedented: assassinating Japan's most brilliant naval strategist using fighter aircraft. The mission required flying 435 miles over open ocean, intercepting Yamamoto's aircraft with perfect timing, and returning safely. A profile that only one American fighter possessed the range, speed, and firepower to accomplish. And Japanese intelligence never imagined Americans would attempt such an audacious long-range interception mission. 16 P-38 Lightnings launched from Guadalcanal, flew at wave-top height to avoid radar detection, and arrived at the interception point with split-second precision. They shot down both Betty bombers carrying Yamamoto and his staff, killing the architect of Pearl Harbor. The shock in Tokyo was profound, not just that Yamamoto was dead, but that American fighters had reached 435 miles from their base, executed a precision interception, and returned safely, demonstrating operational capabilities. Japanese aviation planning had assumed were impossible for carrier-based or land-based fighters operating in the Pacific theater. Japanese intelligence scrambled to reassess P-38 capabilities. The after-action analysis revealed disturbing realities. The Lightning's external drop tanks provided range exceeding 1,000 miles, making virtually every Japanese forward base vulnerable to attack. Its speed, over 400 miles per hour at altitude, meant it could reach targets before defenders could react, and its climb rate allowed it to gain altitude advantage while approaching, fundamentally changing the defensive calculations that had assumed Japanese fighters would have time to intercept approaching threats and engage them on favorable terms. The Yamamoto assassination proved the P-38 wasn't just a fighter, it was a strategic weapon capable of projecting American power across distances that made Japanese defensive dispositions obsolete. Forward bases that seemed secure due to distance from American airfields suddenly became vulnerable, forcing redeployment of assets, disrupting logistics, and creating psychological pressure on commanders who understood nowhere was safe from the twin-boomed assassin. Yet the admiral's death was just the beginning of Japan's P-38 nightmare. The P-38's combat radius fundamentally disrupted Japanese defensive strategy across the Pacific. Traditional fighter deployments assumed defensive aircraft only needed range to intercept bombers approaching nearby targets. The Lightning could escort bombers 600-plus miles from base, loiter over target areas for extended periods, engage defenders, and return with fuel reserves, creating situations where Japanese fighters defending Rabaul or Wewak faced American escorts that had flown distances the Zero couldn't match even in ferry configuration without weapons or ammunition. Japanese planners faced impossible choices. Dispersing assets to avoid concentration that Lightning raids could destroy in single attacks meant reduced defensive strength at each location. Concentrating forces for effective defense meant creating target-rich environments where P-38s could destroy dozens of aircraft on the ground, and the Lightning's range meant that attempting to position forces beyond its reach simply wasn't geographically possible within the island chains Japan was defending, creating strategic paralysis where every disposition option had fatal flaws. The psychological impact on forward base personnel was devastating. Ground crews and pilots at Rabaul, Wewak, and other installations operated knowing P-38s could appear without warning. The Lightning's long range eliminated the early warning time Japanese defenses depended on. Aircraft appeared overhead before radar detection or coast watchers could provide adequate alert, forcing defenders to maintain constant high alert that was physically and mentally exhausting while consuming resources Japan increasingly couldn't spare. Fuel logistics became impossible. Japanese fighters needed to maintain combat air patrol continuously to defend against Lightning raids that could arrive at any time. This defensive burden consumed aviation fuel at rates Japanese logistics couldn't sustain, forcing choices between maintaining adequate defensive patrols or preserving fuel for offensive operations, effectively allowing the P-38's mere existence to drain Japanese aviation resources through defensive requirements, regardless of whether Lightning raids actually materialized on any given day. Range advantages were deadly, but what truly terrified Japanese pilots was survivability. Japanese pilots discovered that killing a P-38 required fundamentally different tactics than destroying single-engine American fighters. The twin-engine configuration provided redundancy that made catastrophic kills extremely difficult to achieve. One engine destroyed meant the Lightning could still fly home on the remaining power plant, damaged but survivable, while single-engine fighters with comparable damage were doomed, creating frustrating combat situations where Japanese pilots knew they'd scored killing hits but watched their targets limp away rather than falling from the sky as doctrine predicted. Zero armament, primarily 20mm cannons with limited ammunition. couldn't deliver the concentrated firepower necessary to destroy both P-38 engines during high-speed attack passes. Japanese pilots had perhaps 2 seconds of firing opportunity before the lightning's speed carried it out of range. Insufficient time to systematically destroy both engines, the cockpit, and flight control systems, while the P-38's defensive armament made prolonged pursuit suicidal, creating tactical situations where Japanese pilots couldn't generate enough damage during available attack windows. The lightning's rugged construction compounded Japanese frustration. Its all-metal, stressed skin airframe absorbed battle damage that would have destroyed the Zero's lightweight structure. Multiple Japanese aces reported emptying entire ammunition loads into P-38s without achieving kills, watching 20mm shells tear holes in wings and fuselage that seemed to have no effect on the aircraft's ability to fly, while return fire from the Lightning's concentrated nose armament, 120mm cannon and 4.50 caliber machine guns, all firing on the same trajectory, proved devastatingly effective. Captured P-38 wreckage examined by Japanese engineers revealed construction quality and material redundancy their industry couldn't replicate. Self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating protecting pilots and critical systems, and structural reinforcement that added weight but provided survivability. One recovered Lightning showed evidence of surviving hits from 37 separate bullets and shell fragments, damage that would have disintegrated 3 Zeros, forcing engineers to acknowledge American willingness to sacrifice performance for durability represented valid philosophy they'd dismissed as inferior engineering. Durability shocked engineers, but pilots faced an even worse tactical reality. Japanese fighter doctrine emphasized close-range turning engagements where the Zero's superior maneuverability would force opponents into prolonged dogfights that Japanese pilot training and aircraft capabilities were optimized to win. The P-38 refused to fight this way, and Japanese tactical doctrine had no effective counter to opponents who simply declined engagement on Japanese terms, creating frustrating combat scenarios where American pilots dictated when, where, and how fights occurred, while Japanese pilots could only react to attacks they couldn't prevent or pursue enemies they couldn't catch. P-38 pilots exploited altitude and speed advantages ruthlessly through boom and zoom tactics. They positioned above Japanese formations, dove at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour, fired devastating bursts from nose-mounted guns, then climbed away before defenders could react. Japanese pilots attempting to pursue found themselves in impossible situations. The Lightning accelerated in dives faster than Zeros could follow, and its climb rate at altitude exceeded Zero performance, meaning pursuit in any direction resulted in the American escaping while Japanese pilots stalled out or ran out of airspeed trying to match vertical maneuvers their aircraft couldn't sustain. The concentrated nose armament made boom and zoom attacks devastatingly effective. Unlike wing-mounted guns requiring convergence at specific ranges, every P-38 weapon fired on identical trajectory. Pilots could open fire at 1,000 yards with reasonable hit probability, ranges where Japanese pilots couldn't effectively return fire, and the weapon concentration meant that hits from even brief bursts caused catastrophic damage, while the Lightning's diving speed gave Japanese pilots no time to maneuver defensively before the attack was over. Japanese commanders issued tactical directives attempting to counter boom and zoom attacks, maintain altitude advantage, avoid being caught below P-38s, never pursue diving Lightnings. But implementing these directives proved impossible in practice. Maintaining altitude advantage required climbing above P-38 patrol altitudes that Zeros couldn't sustain, and avoiding pursuit meant conceding the initiative entirely, effectively granting P-38's freedom to attack at will, while Japanese fighters could only defend passively without ability to force decisive engagements. Tactical frustration evolved into something darker as losses mounted. By mid-1943, Japanese pilot morale suffered under accumulated P-38 encounters that systematically demonstrated zero inadequacies against properly flown American fighters. The psychological burden was devastating. Japanese pilots had been told their training and aircraft were superior, yet combat revealed Americans could engage or disengage at will, survive damage that killed Japanese pilots, and execute tactics Japanese doctrine couldn't counter, forcing recognition that early war victories came from facing unprepared opponents rather than from genuine superiority. Desperate countermeasures failed systematically. Japanese engineers attempted to develop high-altitude interceptors specifically designed to counter P-38 formations. The Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden and Kawanishi N-1KJ reached development but arrived too late and in insufficient numbers. Production problems, material shortages, and pilot inexperience prevented effective deployment. And even when available, these aircraft merely matched P-38 performance rather than exceeding it, meaning Japan's best efforts produced parity at best. While American industrial capacity continued churning out Lightnings in numbers, Japanese production couldn't approach. Tactical innovations proved equally futile. Head-on attacks attempted to exploit the P-38 size and present smaller target profiles to American gunners. This tactic occasionally succeeded, but resulted in catastrophic collision rates as closure speeds exceeded 700 miles per hour, giving pilots milliseconds to fire and break away, and the P-38's concentrated nose armament made head-on approaches suicidal, with American pilots calmly firing single devastating bursts that destroyed Japanese fighters before they could return effective fire. Ramming attacks, deliberate collisions with P-38s were proposed and occasionally attempted by pilots who'd exhausted ammunition. These suicide tactics killed the attacker, sometimes destroyed the target, but represented final acknowledgement that Japanese aviation had no conventional answer to the Lightning, forcing resort to desperation measures that consumed irreplaceable experienced pilots while achieving minimal strategic effect, accelerating the pilot quality collapse that would doom Japanese aviation by 1944. By 1944, the P-38 represented more than tactical problems. The P-38. Lightning ultimately became symbolic of American advantages Japan couldn't overcome: industrial capacity, technological sophistication, and strategic reach that made Japanese resistance increasingly futile, regardless of courage or tactical skill. Every P-38 encounter reminded Japanese pilots that America could build complex twin-engine fighters in thousands, while Japan struggled to produce single-engine aircraft, could waste fuel on long-range patrols while Japan rationed every gallon, and could lose aircraft and pilots while maintaining operational strength that Japanese attrition made unsustainable. The Lightning's success validated American aviation philosophy that Japanese doctrine had dismissed. Range, firepower, and survivability proved more valuable than maneuverability and simplicity. Japanese designers had optimized for dogfighting performance, sacrificing everything else, and discovered too late that modern air combat rewarded aircraft that could choose engagement conditions, survive battle damage, and project power across strategic distances rather than fighters that turned tightly but couldn't reach targets, protect pilots, or sustain operations when damaged. Post-war Japanese aviation historians acknowledged the P-38 forced painful recognition of technological inferiority. Interviews with surviving pilots revealed consistent themes: frustration at being unable to force decisive engagements, fear of the Lightning's range and firepower, and growing awareness that Japan was losing an industrial war where aircraft quality and quantity increasingly favored America. The psychological impact was profound. The strange twin-boomed fighter that Japanese pilots initially mocked became the opponent they least wanted to face. the aircraft that could appear anywhere and that they couldn't effectively counter regardless of tactical innovation or pilot skill. The P-38's legacy in Japanese aviation memory remains dark. It represented the moment when air superiority irrevocably shifted, when tactical brilliance couldn't overcome material disadvantage, and when Japan's aviation dominance collapsed under American industrial might, embodied in a fighter design Japanese engineers had initially dismissed as ridiculous but learned to fear as unstoppable. Japan's P-38 assessment evolved from mockery to terror as the twin-boomed fighter systematically exposed every weakness in Japanese aviation doctrine. Its range made defenses obsolete, its durability frustrated attacks, and its tactics negated Japanese advantages. The Lightning proved that industrial capacity and technological sophistication defeat tactical brilliance when the material gap becomes insurmountable. Watch the next video for more untold aviation stories on vintage planes.